everyone, Anark here, and this is another episode of Anark Abridged, though I'm not sure how abridged this episode would really be. Today I'm going to be responding to an essay written by Nikolai Bukharin called Anarchism or Scientific Communism. It was written in 1918 after the October Revolution in Russia, and Bukharin would have actually been a state official at the time. So in this essay, he is essentially attempting to debunk or fight back against anarchism. And like many essays which seek to fight back against anarchism by authoritarians, it is not terribly long, so that's why I've chosen to do a response video like you see here. You know, if it were sufficiently long, I'd probably need to do an entire video essay, but Bukharin pretty well says what he means in the course of this essay. The reason I've chosen it is because Bukharin's probably one of the more theoretically sophisticated of the Bolsheviks, and here he pretty well lays out a lot of the arguments that we will see authoritarians make for a very long time to come. I think it's probably moderately influential for authoritarians, but it really represents a strain of critique that authoritarian leftists have offered towards anarchists. And so it might be useful for us to look through it in order to get some context as to where the arguments that the authoritarians use today might have rooted from. And we'll probably see quite a few similarities in that sense. I should note, of course, I'm not doing a completely naive react here. I've read through it before, and I'm going to put up the paragraphs as I go on the screen here. So because I'm pretty sure this one's going to take us a little while, we're just going to jump in. So at the very beginning here, he has a paragraph which is kind of a preface paragraph, and it reads, "Economic ruin, the decline of production, are undeniably accompanied by the decline of healthy proletarian psychology, all of which tending to drag the proletariat down to the level of a ragged mob and turning outstanding worker elements with a record of productive activity into declassed individuals, makes for a situation that more or less favors anarchist tendencies. On top of that, the Social Democrats have observed and created confusion about anarchy with their adulteration of Marx. As a result, it is our belief that there is a need to spell out what separates Marxist or scientific communism from anarchist teachings." So you see here the first mention of declassed individuals and people with a record of productive activity being made non-productive. He'll come back to this towards the end of the essay. This is him talking about what they call the lumpen proletariat. So the beginning of section 1, he says, "Let's begin with our own final objective and that of the anarchists. According to the way the problem is posed at present, communism and socialism presuppose the conservation of the state, whereas anarchy eliminates the state. Advocates of the state, as against adversaries of the state, that is how the contrast between Marxists and anarchists is usually depicted." In this essay, we're going to have a discussion about what the state is and the comparison and contrasting of the way that Marxists often view the state and anarchists often view the state. So that's something we're probably going to rehash in numerous of these paragraphs here. Whereas in On Authority, in the discussion I had about On Authority, I said that was not really relevant to the discussion of that essay. It kind of came out of nowhere and only really lasted about one paragraph. Here, I think it is definitely relevant to the discussion. I think this is very central. This is one of the main differences between Marxism and anarchism, according to Bukharin. One must recognize that such an impression of the contrast is not the work of anarchists alone. The Social Democrats are also very much to blame for it. Talk about the state of the future, and the people's state has had widespread currency in the realm of ideas and the phraseology of democracy. Furthermore, some social democratic parties always strive to lay special emphasis on their statist nature. The catchphrase of Austrian social democracy used to be, "We are the true representatives of the state." That sort of thinking was spread by others, too, apart from the Austrian party. In a way, it was commonplace at an international level, and still is to this day, insofar as the old parties have not yet been thoroughly liquidated. And of course, this state learning has nothing to do with the revolutionary communist teachings of Marx. Here we see Bukharin is distancing revolutionary, quote unquote, scientific communists or Marxists from the actions of the Social Democrats. I think it is a wider discussion how different they are, but here we will just kind of not comment on that. He's just trying to draw what he sees as the main distinctions. Scientific communism sees the state as the organization of the ruling class. So this right here, this is important. This is very relevant for the whole essay, okay? And this is relevant if you want to understand Marxist theory as well, that the Marxists think of the state as being the, as he says here, instrument of oppression and violence for the ruling class. So he says, scientific communism sees the state as the organization of the ruling class, an instrument of oppression and violence, and it is on these grounds that it does not countenance a quote-unquote state of the future. In the future, there will be no classes. There will be no class oppression, and thus no instrument of that oppression, no state of violence. The classless state, a notion that turns the head of social democrats, is a contradiction in terms, a nonsense, and abuse of language. And if this notion is the spiritual nourishment of the social democracy, it is really no fault of the great revolutionaries Marx and Engels. So again, he's just distancing Marxism from social democracy. He's basically trying to say, indeed, if we eliminate classes, then we have eliminated the need for the state. Moreover, they seem to think that means you would just, in practice, eliminate the state itself. But I think it's just important to take away that very first part, that scientific communism or Marxism sees the state as the organization of the ruling class. He says, communist society is, as such, a stateless society. If this is the case, and there is no doubt that it is, then what in reality does the distinction between anarchists and Marxist communists consist of? Does the distinction as such vanish, at least when it comes to examining the problem of the society to come and the ultimate goal? No. The distinction does exist, but it's to be found elsewhere and can be defined as a distinction between production centralized under large trusts and small decentralized production. So I think here, and I will say in this entire first section, this is the strongest piece of the entire essay. I think here at least, even though I disagree with Bukharin, and I'll explain why I think that he's misunderstood to some degree, even though I will at least regard that he's referring to something that has to do with anarchism here. This entire first section is actually at least somewhat well argued. He's drawing meaningful distinctions of a sort, and he is highlighting differences in the sort of terminology and the analytic framework that Marxists and anarchists typically use to understand the topics at hand. So throughout this entire first section, I think it should be said that Bukharin's doing a decent job of presenting his point. However, I do want to say this concept that he is presenting here first, and that he's going to go on to discuss as we proceed through the essay, that anarchism is just based around small, decentralized production, is still kind of missing the point. I will say decentralization is correct in a sense. I think he's on the right track by talking about decentralization, and we will continue on that topic here in the next few paragraphs. But I think he is not understanding that this decentralization does not consist of no coordination and no organization, that decentralization does not necessarily entail small, that you might actually be able to have a decentralization of power while still having a bunch of not necessarily small, but various sized means of production for any given thing, depending on the thing and its necessity. But I'm going to get into that more as he discusses this more. we communists believe not only that the society of the future must free itself of the exploitation of man, but also that it will have to ensure for man the greatest possible independence of the nature that surrounds him, that it will reduce to a minimum the time spent of socially necessary labor, developing the social forces of production to a maximum, and likewise the productivity itself of social labor. So probably for people that are not super familiar with Marxist ideology, this paragraph might be a little confusing, but it should start off, we should start here by noting he's talking about ensuring for man the greatest possible independence of the nature that surrounds him. I think this is one of the main flaws of the leftism of the late 1800s and early 1900s. It tended to think of nature as an enemy, something that we were trying to overcome, not something that we necessarily live in harmony with, or that we try to create systems of interdependence with. It has this idea that we are attempting to dominate the natural world, that it is our enemy, and that we are trying to survive it. Very much the product of Enlightenment thinking. And I kind of fundamentally disagree with this framing, it should be said. But I think that a lot of anarchists might have agreed with it, because you'll find the same kind of language in the anarchists of this time as well. So I don't think this is really the flaw of Bukharin. But I also think he kind of clarifies a little bit here what he means, that he's talking about also the kind of a domination of nature that makes it to where we have to labor unnecessarily, to do unproductive labor that takes up more and more of our time. So the idea that he says we should reduce to a minimum the time spent of socially necessary labor. He's basically trying to say we should be able to get more done with less labor if things were organized properly. And it's implied, of course, previously here, that he thinks that that would occur through centralization, and that centralization would be needed in order to drive down the socially necessary labor time. And then he's also implying here that you would have to develop the social forces of production to a maximum in order to get that productivity of social labor. Okay, so that's kind of part of the basis of his argument and conception. It's part of the reason why he's going to be tending towards centralization here, arguing that it's necessary to have that centralization to reduce the amount of labor that we have to put in to get what is necessary. But let's move on here. Our ideal solution to this is centralized production, methodically organized in large units, and, in the final analysis, the organization of the world economy as a whole. Anarchists, on the other hand, prefer a completely different type of relations of production. Their ideal consists of tiny communes, which by their very structure are disqualified from managing any large enterprises, but reach agreements with one another and link up through a network of free contracts. So there's more to this paragraph. I'll continue in a moment, but this is back to his sort of misunderstanding. And I think that his misunderstanding is on one hand understandable. On another hand, it's bizarre that he would even think that this is the case, given that anarchists were at that time very notable advocates of organization. Like, social anarchism would have been the default at this stage in history. So he would have had lots of examples on hand of anarchists organizing trade unions and direct action and creating large-scale strikes like that. That would have been common knowledge around this time. So it's weird here that he seems to think that there would be no wide-scale organization, that the anarchists are not tending towards wide-scale organization. Also, his conception that what anarchists are arguing for are tiny communes. I think this is also a very common misunderstanding that not only Marxists, but lots of people have about anarchists. I will say, I think we have the benefit of hindsight now, being in 2023, and having seen the outcome of the Spanish Civil War, having seen the sorts of structures that the anarchists built. And also just around this time, perhaps unbeknownst to Bukharin, because it would have been happening at the same time, in the Ukraine, they were developing robust, large-scale structures that coordinated large numbers of people together. And what we see in all of these occasions is that the anarchists aren't looking for small-scale production necessarily, though don't get me wrong, there are many occasions which that would be much preferable and perhaps may even avoid things like ecological disaster. It's not necessarily that anarchists are attached to small-scale production. it's true that they are attached to decentralization, but that's just because they think that decisions should start from the bottom. So and this is something I've discussed many times in my videos. Anarchism is a desire for all power to root to the very bottom, wherein people come together and make decisions together about the scales of structures that they're going to build. If they are going to build larger and larger scales, and they're going to implement some form of centralization, which is to say where they're going to focus a huge amount of effort into one, big factory or big entity, some enormous farm or something, they should all be coming to that decision together. Whereas with the authoritarians, what they're doing, and when they talk about centralizing production, they're actually talking about centralizing decision-making power as well, so that the majority of the decisions, the most pressing decisions that are being made at the very, very top by a relatively small group of people. So that's the real difference in centralization and decentralization between these two trends. However, Bukharin has sort of mistakenly thought that anarchists would never support large-scale industry or large-scale production. And this is where he is mistaken, that he doesn't understand. They want production to be at the scale wherein humans can understand it, where humans can understand it and make decisions about it, and wherein, if they cannot, experts can come and offer paths forward for them. So, it's on one hand understandable that Bukharin didn't know this. He lived before, for example, the Spanish Civil War. He also did not really know a whole lot about what was happening in Ukraine at the time. However, it demonstrates that he wasn't understanding them very well, given that these were the sorts of outcomes of what took place when anarchists carried out their principles in practice. So let's continue. Let's see here. He says, from an economic point of view, that sort of system of production is clearly closer to the medieval communes rather than the mode of production destined to supplant the capitalist system. But this system is not merely a retrograde step, it is also utterly utopian. The society of the future will not be conjured out of a void, nor will it be brought about by a heavenly angel. It will rise out of the old society, out of the relations created by the gigantic apparatus of finance capital. Any new order is possible and useful only insofar as it leads to the further development of the productive forces of the order which is to disappear. Naturally, further development of the productive forces is only conceivable as the continuation of the tendency of the productive process of centralization as an intensified degree of organization in the administration of things that replaces the bygone government of men. Once again, this may be a little bit crunchy. I don't know. I know I have a big variation in knowledge levels in my audience, but the long and short of what Bukharin is saying here is that whatever will build the next world will come from the things that are being currently built by the prevailing system. So capitalism tending towards this monopolization of resources, tending towards holding more and more of this, private assets, is leading more and more towards centralization and large-scale production. And therefore, if communism is to come, he is saying that it must be able to utilize the development which has taken place from the capitalist system. It has to be able to take those means of production out of the hands of the capitalists and put them to work in the new order of society. And he thinks, I suppose, that anarchists fundamentally disagree with this. But in reality, anarchists just have a more nuanced opinion about this. They think that the way that infrastructure is developed will make a difference. The way that all of those projects are managed and decided, and the way this quote unquote administration of things takes place. Who makes the decisions? How are things decided? That is one of the most important parts. Anarchists, we can see in practice, once they are able to seize large amounts of territory, do not generally tend towards destroying the assets that they've got and then trying to get everybody to flee out to a bunch of rural communes and restart production by making a bunch of rural communes. So Bukharin is just straw manning the anarchists here. This is just really not an accurate portrayal of what anarchists want, nor what anarchists actually do in practice when they are able to carry out a revolution. So Perhaps the idea here is just that Bukharin doesn't really understand the anarchists he's spoken to, and probably has not put in the effort to read about anarchism, if I had to guess. I think that if he had only read for example, Bukharin or even Kropotkin, he would have found that this was a mistaken understanding, though perhaps I could see some of this, especially these mention of agreements, may come from a mistaken reading of Kropotkin, especially considering he was Russian. But anyway, moving on. Well, now, the anarchists will reply, the essence of the state consists precisely of centralization, and since you keep the centralization of production, you must also keep the state apparatus, the power of violence, in short, authoritarian relations. Now, I will say, I think Bukharin has done a good job anticipating the possible response here. I think you can hear from the response I had to the last paragraph that he's got about 10% of it, but he is at least understanding the arguments that are going to come out of the opponent somewhat well, insofar as that he recognizes the anarchists are really opposing that fundamental centralization relation, right? And he's going to go on to tell us that he just thinks that that's not how it works, that it's not centralization that is the problem, and centralization is not the state, essentially. If you'd like to see me refute this, you can basically just go watch The State is Counter-Revolutionary. All four parts exactly lay out how the anarchist analysis that the state is if not synonymous with centralization of power, that one of its most important components is centralization of power, and that you cannot have a state without centralization, and that if you do have centralization, you will produce state relations, precisely as Bukharin is going to try to deny. But if you'd like to see me address that more at length, you can go watch my video series, The State is Counter-Revolutionary. But we'll continue here and keep responding to what he has to say. He says, that reply is incorrect, for it presupposes an unscientific, but rather wholly infantile conception of the state. You can see he's devolved into insult here, and just supposing that the other side must be unscientific because they disagree with him. I think this is a very good indication when somebody is becoming polemic and is not making really a very reasoned or logical argument, but is instead now operating from a knee-jerk reaction. But we'll continue. He says, the state, just like capital, is not an object, but a relationship between social classes. Yeah, so he's kind of on the right track, except he probably doesn't understand how those classes are actually formed, how they are formed into those relations with one another, and probably he has a rigid conception that the classes can only arise as these economic entities, or that there can only be these tiers of rulership based on economic supremacy. He says, it is the class relationship obtaining between he who rules and he who is ruled. Now that is correct. This relationship is the very essence of the state. Should this relationship cease, the state would cease to exist. Now, I don't know about that. It's not necessarily the case that just because you have abolished the things that necessitated the state, that the state might not stick around as some sort of vestigial organ which perpetuates hierarchical things into the world afterwards. The state does not just disappear into thin air magically. The state must be abolished or deconstructed. So let's continue. To see in centralization an essential feature of the state is to make the same mistake as is made by those who regard the means of production as capital. The means of production become capital only when they are a monopoly in the hands of one class and serve to exploit another class on the basis of wage labor. That is to say, when these means of production are the expression of the social relationships of class oppression and class economic exploitation. In themselves, the means of production are something to be admired, the instrument of man's struggle against nature. It is understood, then, that not only will they not vanish in the society of the future, but for the first time ever, they will enjoy the place they deserve. I don't think he's really getting to the crux of the argument here. I don't think he's really understanding. If anything, it seems like he's almost understanding, but he's like this close, but he's going to veer way off track. And that is to say, he understands that the means of production become capital only when they are a monopoly in the hands of one class and serve to exploit another class on the basis of wage labor. So what he's basically realizing is that the existing levers of power in some power structure, they are oppressive insofar as they are wielded by a ruling class or a group of rulers over a ruled population. And what he doesn't seem to understand is that wherever that power is centralized, those will become the rulers. That power creates rulers. The rulers do not arise magically out of a system. That the rulers are going to be whoever holds the power, and the more centralized it is, the narrower your group of rulers will be. So he's getting this all mixed up, the critique of the state by anarchists, its relation to centralization, with thinking anarchists must therefore be against the development of the means of production. I do think that there is a discussion to be had about how some development of the means is not necessarily good. There's not going to be any way to repurpose some kinds of infrastructure in order to create in a liberatory society. However, most of the time, technology is neutral. It's more about how it is relating to everything around it. So in a very big sense, I actually agree with Bukharin in this paragraph. I just don't think he really understands what the anarchist critique is about infrastructural development and productive development. He says, of course, there was a time in the labor movement when the workers were not yet clear on the difference between the machine as a means of production and the machine as capital, that is, as a means of oppression. Nonetheless, at that time, the workers tended not to do away with private ownership of the machines, but to destroy the machines themselves, so as to return to primitive manual means of labor. Yeah, no, I think he is misunderstanding the Luddites big time. I think the Luddites were really a striking population. The Luddites were destroying these machines because these machines were being used to oppress them. I agree with Bukharin that ultimately those same machines could be used to liberate them if they had control over how those machines were being used, but that's the key distinction. The key distinction is that they were not in control over how those machines were used, and therefore their destruction of those machines was a form of sabotage in order to slow down the concentration of power by those capitalists. But I would also like to note one thing that always strikes me about this conception that just the development of the means of production is just this unqualified good is that it sort of presumes that if it just keeps developing and keeps developing and keeps developing, that we will just move towards communism, that capitalism getting more and more means of production organized in the sense that it desires them to be organized, that is the means of transforming towards communism. However, as I've brought up many times, that's not necessarily the case. Capitalism is building out capitalist infrastructure. It's not necessarily good that the enemy system is getting more and more time to solidify itself. And it may very well be that a lot of what it's built will not even be able to be used, and that it needs to be defeated quickly before it can develop more and more tools of oppression, before it can create, before it can develop the means of production in such a way that they serve as tools of oppression in perpetuity. So, but let's continue. There's an analogy here with the position of anarchists, who are class conscious, on the centralization of production. Seeing that capitalist centralization is a method of oppression, they protest, in their simplicity, against all centralization of production in general. Their infantile naivety confuses the essence of the thing with its social, historical, outward form. Once again, I note that when he sort of stoops to an insult here, infantile naivety, it's precisely to cover up that he hasn't really explained anything about why he doesn't think centralization will lead to authoritarian relations, why he doesn't think that centralizing production, creating a smaller and smaller class of people who will manage it, absorbing those functions into bureaucrats or technocrats of various kinds, will not lead to an oppressive ruling class. Notice he's literally not making any arguments against that. Every time he comes up upon the point where he should be making an argument to defend that point, he doesn't. He stoops to an insult like infantile naivety confuses the essence of the thing with its social, historical, outward form. And this actually really hits on why I say that a lot of Marxist analysis, when it comes to how power works, when it comes to how political power works, it is non-materialist. It's idealist. They believe that you can take a machine that is built a certain way, okay, that is built towards a particular end, and then radically transform it just by putting people with different ideas inside that same machine. The way, Rudolf Rocker talks about it is like, you imagine that you're going to take like a stomach and turn it into an ear, or you're going to take a foot and you're going to turn it into wings. Like this idea that you're going to, it's built for particular purposes. Centralization of large scale industry is built towards the purpose of empowering a ruling class. So, like this conception that you can just like put an enlightened vanguard in the seat of power over inside of a machine that is built to oppress, and that somehow it will stop being an oppressive machine, is in fact the very thing that they don't seem to understand. And it's the reason why that every single time one of these state capitalist regimes comes into power, that everything leads to this authoritarian endpoint, where they essentially just devolve back into capitalism most of the time, or some form of social democracy. It's because they don't understand that they are advocating for a machine that is built to oppress them. They're trying to use the enemy's machine. And that's why a lot of anarchists say they don't have a materialist understanding of the state. He says, and so the distinction between us communists and the anarchists with regard to bourgeois society lies not in that we are for the state and they are against the state, but rather in that we favor production being centralized in large units, fitted to the maximum development of productive forces, whereas anarchists favor small, decentralized production, which cannot raise, but only lower the level of these productive forces. I've already kind of responded to this, but I just want to note that it's weird how he doesn't even, perhaps it's because he's, 100 years ago and he doesn't understand how a technology is going to develop. But you notice that he seems to think that all of this development of technology is going to move towards increasing centralization, when what we really see is as technology gets more and more developed, it actually seems like we gain more and more of the capability to decentralize. For example, you imagine 3D printers that decentralizes production, computers, household, personal computers like the one I'm using right now, that decentralizes production. Having more people that can own something like a camera, that means that now there are more cameras, that decentralizes production. We're not moving towards, the state of all cameras being that there's one really big, awesome camera that everybody shares. The actual thing we're moving towards is decentralization of power, and that in a general sense that does coordinate with lowering scale. But anarchists are not obsessed with lowering scale. They are focused singularly upon absorbing as much of the power of decision making by default into the masses of people as conceivably possible. So that was the end of section 1. Now we are on to section 2. I think there are 3 sections in total here. He says, the second essential issue that divides communists and anarchists is their attitude to the dictatorship of the proletariat. So I'm going to just say as we proceed into this section, whereas that first section, I think that there was a lot of valuable stuff. And at least I think you could see that there was like a good conversation to be had there. As you heard, I disagree with him. I don't think he really understood precisely. I think he got several of the points wrong, both on their own basis and in misunderstanding what anarchists were saying. here I really have a much less charitable opinion. I think he does a much worse job of understanding everything about the topic he's discussing. Perhaps he's doing an okay job of understanding it from a Marxist standpoint, but he seems to have literally no idea how anarchists think about violence and revolution and maintaining power over reactionaries and so on. Once again, he was living before the free territories in Ukraine and the CNTFAI in Spain and a wave of anarchist revolutions that took place in the early 1900s. But nonetheless, he gets so many things wrong here. We're just going to go into it. He says, in between capitalism and the society of the future lies a whole period of class struggle, the period during which the last remains of bourgeois society will be rooted out and the class attacks provoked by the bourgeoisie already fallen, but still resisting, fought off. The experience of the October Revolution has shown that even after it has been thrown on its back on the ground, the bourgeoisie still uses what resources remain to it to go on fighting against the workers, and that ultimately it relies on international reaction in such a way that the final victory of the workers will be possible only when the proletariat has freed the whole world of the capitalist rabble and completely suffocated the bourgeoisie. So, okay. As we're going to see, he seems to just think that anarchists don't want to suppress reaction. They don't want to fight against the bourgeoisie. I guess they think that what anarchists believe is that we're going to do a revolution. Maybe, I don't know. He even kind of brings that into doubt. And then instantly we're going to have defeated the bourgeoisie, and then we can just do whatever we like and reform everything on the spot. But that really is not the opinion of anarchists anywhere I've read. I mean, I do think that sometimes individualist anarchists have tended to see it that way, but social anarchism was the majority trend at the time he's making these comments. So it's kind of odd what he's talking about right now. And really his whole section is kind of a very weak and confusing critique of anarchists. So, yeah, here he basically is just saying what we found is that obviously you just have to keep fighting the bourgeoisie, and you can't stop fighting them, and therefore using the quote-unquote dictatorship of the proletariat, as we'll see he's going to discuss, to until you've defeated the whole world of the capitalist rabble. That did not end up coming to fruition. That ended up being a very naive point of view that you couldn't do anything, or that we had to rely on a global revolution happening all at once. They had great conditions for that, and it still didn't happen. So, and only then would you have completely suffocated the bourgeoisie. And I guess then he's saying we could transition to something else. But anyway, next he says, for this reason, it is quite natural that the proletariat makes use of an organization for its struggle. We agree. Once again, at the time you were writing this, Bukharin, the vast majority of anarchists were organizationalist anarchists. He says, the bigger, the stronger, and the more solid this organization is, the more rapidly will the final victory be won. Such a transitional organization is the proletarian state, the power and the rule of the workers, their dictatorship. So let's just cut straight to the chase here. If all the Marxists mean by the dictatorship of the proletariat, or a proletarian state, is the entity by which the workers defend themselves from bourgeois oppression and the return of hierarchical power and the bourgeois state and all of that, then this is a trivial problem. We're just literally talking about a different usage of words, in which case, well, then anarchists support a proletarian state, and anarchists support the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, I think what we actually find is that that's not actually what's going on here. They're kind of, it's like a Mott and Bailey. They're confusing us about what they're actually talking about a lot of the time. because, as we've seen, he wants to maintain the traditional state, which is to say centralization and therefore deprivation of the masses from control over the world. So he doesn't just, they're not actually just calling any entity which is the workers defending themselves from bourgeois rule a dictatorship of the proletariat. That's false. Otherwise, they would believe that anarchists want a dictatorship of the proletariat. If they do think that, that's fine. Perhaps it would demonstrate they're less confused than beforehand, but they never concede to that because they are hiding a series of nested points they are not immediately discussing. He says, like all power, the power of the proletarians is likewise organized violence. I mean, that's one part of it, sure. And he says, like all states, the proletarian state is likewise an instrument of oppression. I mean, I guess this is a weird one. This comes back to this like kind of on authority brained conception where it's like they think that freeing yourself from a slave master, breaking your shackles is authoritarian because you're imposing your will on the slave master. I think they fundamentally don't understand that oppression is not just when oppression and authority is not just when somebody is imposed upon. Oppression is that state of existence, like, for example, how he called the concentration and monopolization of power in the capitalist economy. He called capital, right? And that similar thing is taking place in the state. So here, if indeed the proletarian state is what it is described as, it's anti-authoritarian. It's the destruction of authority because authority is central or is a concentration of monopolization of power. It is anti-oppression because it destroys the forces of oppression in society. It lowers those impulses by scale. You might imagine that if under, a despotic power structure, it was an 8 out of 10 on the oppression scale. When we destroy the despotic structure and we distribute power, oppression is going down. It means it's an act that reduces oppression. That means that we're reducing authoritarianism. So this point will never land. This point will, these sorts of like rhetorical gambles that the authoritarians love to pull to mask the fact that they actually are just asking for authoritarianism in the objective sense, not in the subjective sense, in the objective sense. I think that these are always just rhetorical masks. He says, there is no need to be so circumspect about the question of violence. Anarchists are not really that circumspect about the question of violence. Once again, self-defense is violence, right? Such circumspection is best left to the good Christian or the Tolstoyan, not the revolutionary. In coming down for or against violence, there's a need to see who is directed against. Revolution and counter-revolution are acts of violence in equal measure, but to renounce revolution for that reason would be nonsensical. Yes. Agreed. Kind of seems like you're shadowboxing a ghost here. I don't know what you think anarchists believe. Do you think that anarchists don't support violence in a revolution? I mean, go read anarchists. Like, I don't know. It's not as if this is, this can't be claimed as like him preceding not knowing about the free territories or the C&T FAI. Like he could have read any anarchist of the time. Does he think? It's so bizarre. Anarchists were associated in large part with like bombing campaigns and adventurism and the willingness to do like violence against the power structure. What point does he think he's making here? I mean, anarchists fought. This is after the October Revolution. Like anarchists fought side by side with them to overthrow the Tsar and to put in place this new power structure that they are currently inside of here in 1918. It's just, what is he talking about? Like, this is so weird. It's just out and out a straw man. Says the same thing applies when we come to the question of power and the proletarian's authoritarian violence. Once again, the proletariat does not exhibit authoritarian violence. The proletariat, by defending itself, is actually undergoing an anti-authoritarian act. It is the dissolution, the destruction of authority. It is the dissolution of monopoly. It is the distribution of power, which is the opposite of authoritarianism. He says, certainly this violence is a means of oppression, but one employed against the bourgeoisie. That implies a system of reprisals, but these reprisals in their turn are likewise directed against the bourgeoisie. Whenever the class struggle reaches its point of maximum tension and becomes civil war, one cannot go around talking about individual liberty. Rather, one must talk about the need to systematically repress the exploiter class. Yeah, this is so weird. So weird how they think that individual liberty just means anybody gets to do anything they want. But I think what they don't seem to be understanding is that protecting people's freedom to act in the world requires the repression of the freedom of exploiters. Exploiters limit everyone's freedom. Authoritarians concentrate power. That limits everybody's freedom to act. And by doing so, then when we stop the authoritarian from concentrating power, when we demonopolize that power, we are doing something which increases individual liberty in that process. We're not trying to maximize individual liberty for every single person. We're trying to maximize individual liberty across the board, distributed among people. It's not that we don't care about the individual liberty of the slave master to hold a slave, because that is an individual liberty that relies on suppressing the freedom of the slave, the autonomy of the slave. So this is just a nonsensical understanding, and I can't help but feel it's a bad faith straw man. He couldn't have believed that this is what anarchists thought. He says the proletariat must choose between two things. Either it crushes the dislodged bourgeoisie once and for all and defends itself against their international allies, or it does not. In the first instance, the work must be organized. Yes, we agree, Bukharin. Conducted in a systematic fashion and taken as far as resources allow. That's kind of vague. Not sure what you're getting at there. I think, are you talking about literally just genociding them? I don't know. That's probably not the correct line, and certainly was not what the Bolsheviks ended up doing, nor what they even seemed to try to do. They seemed happy to let the bourgeoisie become technicians and operators within corporations, even giving them private entities in some occasions. So yeah, once again, anarchists agree you need an organized force to oust all reaction. You need to protect the revolution, and that is self-defense. That is anti-authoritarianism. The return of the bourgeois would be the return of authoritarianism. And so, yeah, of course we defend, that's self-defense. The force is the state power of the proletariat. Then it's meaningless. Then it means that, okay, so you have a group of people. Let's say there's a group of 10 people, and, two of them want to enslave the other 8. Okay. Why do they do it? Who knows? It could be anything. It doesn't even have to be class. Let's just say it's because they were born in one place as opposed to the other. Okay. And they propose that the 2 of them are going to rule over the other 8. If those other 8 simply don't allow them to do so, is this oppression of the other 2? No. It's prevention of oppression. It's prevention of oppression arising. It's prevention of authoritarianism concentrating. So and is that a state? If that's a state, you're telling me, so 8 people preventing themselves from being enslaved is a state. Absurd. Doesn't make any sense. And furthermore, it doesn't make sense in a long-term sense because you're always going to have reactionaries. People are always going to have to be able to defend themselves from abusers and exploiters of all different kinds. So does that mean that the mass of society, when it defends themselves from abusers and exploiters, is the state because the abusers and the exploiters are being oppressed? No, this is a nonsense understanding. This is such a niche, little subjective understanding, which tries to make the plight of the bourgeois the same as the plight of the oppressed class. And it's just false. There is no analytic depth to it. It is nothing more than a rhetorical defense without substance. He says, class differences do not vanish from the world at the stroke of a pen. Okay, so this is extremely familiar. Authoritarians love saying this. They're always, telling us about their gradualism and how we can't do things too fast. And, we saw that a little bit at the beginning, and I think it was formed in a more understandable way at that point. Here, I think that Bukharin is engaged in polemic, but we'll continue. The bourgeoisie does not vanish as a class after it loses political power. Similarly, the proletariat is always proletariat, even after its victory. No, that's only true insofar as I suppose the bourgeois still exist, but the bourgeois are not transcendentally bourgeois. They're bourgeois by way of their monopoly control over the means of production. So if you have ousted them from control of the means of production, they are no longer the bourgeois. They're just people who are reactionaries, who identify with a way of being that you have destroyed, that you have ousted. And yes, they're your enemies, but they're not the quote unquote bourgeois because they don't own anything. You expropriated all of their belongings. If there are no more bourgeois, there's no more proletariat. And there's only a bourgeois if you allowed them to continue existing, which is to say if they continue to own assets or they own monopoly control over private entities in society. But that's not the conditions that you're supposed to allow. You're supposed to be abolishing their control over those things. You're supposed to be expropriating in mass the belongings of the capitalists. So this doesn't really make a lot of sense. I'm not the first person to point this out. This is a very old critique of this conception. He says, of course, it has assumed its position as ruling class, not if you've already expropriated it. That doesn't make sense. It's not anymore. It's an ousted ruling class. It has to maintain that position or merge with the rest of society. It can't maintain that position. It doesn't own the assets that it once had. It is now just a reactionary, militant contingent that is trying to destroy your society. And you're right, it's not going to merge with the rest of society, and they're going to fight you to the bitter end. But they are no longer the quote-unquote bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, in Marxist understanding, is defined by its relation to the means of production. It no longer has that relation, so it's no longer the bourgeoisie. When you oppress those people, you are not, when you repress those people, you are not repressing the bourgeoisie, you are repressing the previous bourgeoisie. I don't know. This is just not logically sound. He said, it has to maintain that position or merge with the rest of society, which is profoundly hostile towards it, right? That is the problem as it arises historically, and there are no two ways of resolving it. I don't think anybody was denying that. The sole solution is this: as the motive force behind the revolution, the proletariat has a duty to hold on to its dominant position until it has succeeded in remolding other classes in its image. Then and only then, the proletariat dismantles its state organization and the state dies out. See, this is very odd, okay? Because the bourgeoisie is the vast is the minority. Okay. It's a minority of society. Usually it's, like less than 1%. Okay. Not very many people own the means of production. And after this, then that means if you've eliminated even that small group of owners, I would say that you've just transferred it in state capitalism, you transferred it into state functionaries, then that's just all of society. That's all of society. That's the proletariat. And then in what way are the masses of people the state in that sense? Just because they repress exploiters, then you believe the state will never disappear. Because the state, if you think that repressing exploiters and just maintaining a dominant position of a solidaric society over exploiters is the state, then the state is perpetual because exploiters will continue trying to exploit people no matter what kind of society you make. And maybe there will be fewer of them, but they will still exist. There will still just be people who are trying to break the system in any system. So that means that there will always be a state if that's the case. And I think that this really, when you start to tease this out and turn it over, you can see why it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It doesn't hold together. It's not a strong analytic framework. And that's why none of their predictions came true. That's why nothing they thought about the state came to fruition in any occasion. It was a unanimously failed set of predictions about how the state functions and how the state could function. He says, the anarchists take a different stand on the question of this transitional period, and the difference between us and them boils down, in effect, to being for or against the proletarian common state, as we've said, by their definition. Anarchists aren't. And for or against the dictatorship of the proletariat. Again, by their definition and their understanding, anarchists aren't, because their definition doesn't make sense. So even anti-statists, by their definition, are statists, because they've defined, as they do with the word authoritarian, they've expanded the meaning of this word to be nebulous so that it doesn't mean anything, and a really strong, rigorous discussion about the topic can't be had. Instead, they have defined it into a corner where you can only take their line. If you accept their definition, you can only take their line. And then here's the part where he is just so completely off. And if you have read my work, A Modern Anarchism, or the essay Power, you'll just see how he is completely off base here. He says, for anarchists, all power, let alone general power, is unacceptable, whatever the circumstances, because it amounts to oppression, even if directed against the bourgeoisie. You know, as you can already just see from the things I've said during this video that this is just utterly false. This is 0% true. 0%. Go read my work. Go read Power. Go listen to the video Power. Watch the video Power. Go watch A Modern Anarchism, parts 1, 2, and 3. You'll see that this is just absolutely false. He says, for this reason, and at the current stage in the development of the revolution, anarchists are at one with the bourgeoisie and collaborationist parties in raising a furor against the power of the proletariat. This is ridiculous. This is of all the statements in this essay so far, this one is the most ridiculous. He just fought in a revolutionary war with anarchists. They fought for the proletarian power structure that was created. They fought with violence to defend themselves from authority, to defend themselves from the oppressive state that they were living under. And he thinks to himself, but the anarchists are against all power because it's unacceptable under whatever circumstances, because it amounts to oppression, even if directed against the bourgeoisie. What an absolutely mind-blowingly absurd claim. Absolutely 0% correct, with no correlation to reality. Anarchists, in fact, were the original revolutionists in the First International and the St. Amir Congress and all of that. They were the ones advocating the general overthrow of society, where the Marxists in the beginning were social democrats and had to distance themselves from social democracy as time went on. This is absolutely absurd. It just made up. He says, whenever anarchists cry out against the power of the proletariat, they don't cry out against the power of the proletariat. They cease to be the leftists or radicals they are usually labeled. On the contrary, they turn into bad revolutionaries, unwilling to lead an organized, systematic class struggle against the bourgeoisie. Yeah, just made up. In renouncing the dictatorship of the proletariat, they deprive themselves of the most valid weapon in the struggle. In fighting against that dictatorship, they disorganize the proletariat's forces, snatching their weapons from their grasp, and objectively give succor to the bourgeoisie and its agents, the social traders. Yeah, this is just slander, like straight up slander. This is not even a straw man. This is lower than a polemic. He's literally just lying and insulting people who sacrificed their lives in revolutionary wars, a revolutionary war that he was part of. And right next door in Ukraine, they were fighting a revolutionary war. The anarchists were fighting a revolutionary war. Just absolutely absurd thing to claim. This paragraph is shameful. He says, it's easy to detect just what the fundamental notion is that accounts for the anarchist stance on the society of the future and their stance on the dictatorship of the proletariat. It boils down to their aversion, as a matter of principle, so to speak, to the technique of systematic organized mass action. Again, absolute nonsense. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a split in anarchist milieus, and it really only arose after this period of time between individualist and social anarchists. And the individualists do tend to be more anti-organizationalist. They're not all anti-organizationalists, but most of them are anti-organizationalist. If indeed that Bukharin were referring to this at that time, extremely tiny contingent of the anarchists, then yeah, I mean, I would kind of agree with this critique that if you oppose mass organized action of the people coordinated together, then yeah, you're you're holding back the revolution. And these are part of my critiques of individualists sometimes, is that this unwillingness to form real organizational power structure, like organized power structures, it holds us back from succeeding and actually defeating the power structure. It weakens us. So I would agree with Bukharin if that were who he was targeting. But I think, as with most critiques of anarchists, they don't know enough about anarchism to be able to discern different types of anarchism and to be able to discern whether their critique lands with the general populace of anarchists. And I should say, at the time, it absolutely did not. This was nonsense. At the time, the anarcho-syndicalists were prolifically involved in the Russian Revolution, and they were prolifically involved in the development of workers' councils and factory committees and trade unions all across Russia before the Civil War. But he goes on to deny all of this and get real confused, it looks like. It follows from anarchist theory that the consistent anarchist must be averse to Soviet power and fight against it. No, the anarchists are for Soviet power. Just what was created after 1917 was no longer Soviets. They were a bunch of cantonal bodies under the control of the central power structure. The Soviets were supposed to be a bottom-up power structure, in which case the anarchists would be all about it. But no. And then he goes on, of course, this confusion compounds. Given that such a stance would be clearly absurd for workers and peasants, the number of anarchists whose principles lead them to such a position is not great. Yeah, that's because none of them oppose that. The Soviets and the workers' councils and the factory committees and the trade unions are the techniques that anarchists use. Those are anarchist methods. They oppose the centralization of power above the Soviets and the creation of Soviets that have power over the lower Soviets instead of vice versa. On the contrary, there are anarchists quite satisfied to take a seat in the supreme legislature and executive of the state power of the proletariat, namely in the Central Executive Committee of the Soviet. I will say that that's somewhat contradictory to anarchist principles, but probably a lot of the anarchists saw this just as an opportunity to hopefully move things in the right direction. But they do not oppose the Soviets as general concept. They oppose the representative nature of the pyramidal structure of the USSR in his context, it should be said. But he says that this is a contradiction is obvious, a departure from the true anarchist viewpoint. Not really the first part, but understood on the second part. He says, but it's understood that the anarchists cannot have any special affection for the Soviets. No, as I just said, it's not true. At best, they merely exploit them and are ever ready to dismantle them. They're just nonsense, more slander, literally made up stuff. The anarchists did not want to dismantle the Soviets. They wanted to empower the Soviets. They wanted to disempower the centralized state apparatus and empower the Soviets. He said, further, from this situation arises a rather far-reaching practical difference. As far as we are concerned, the chief task is to give the power of the mass proletarian organizations, the workers' councils, the widest possible base by strengthening and organizing them, whereas the anarchists have consciously to obstruct that work. Once again, absolutely absurd. The workers' councils, that's what the anarchists supported. That's what the Bolsheviks undermined. Now, maybe at this time they were still giving lip service to the workers' councils, but as soon as like a month after the October Revolution, they were already undermining the workers' councils and the factory committees. That was like one of the first things the Bolsheviks did, was undermine the power of the Soviets, undermine the power of the workers' councils. The anarchists were the ones objecting to the disempowerment of the workers' councils. So this is absolutely a duplicitous lie from Bukharin. And I would expect better of him because he actually seems like he's smart enough to make a well-structured argument. But these last few paragraphs are just him making things up wholesale. We also differ widely in the courses we take in the province of what shape economic praxis ought to take during the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The fundamental conditions for economic victory over capitalism consists of ensuring that the expropriation of the expropriators does not degenerate into an atomization, even should it be into equal shares. Any new share out produces small property holders, but big capitalist property grows out of small property. And in this way, a share out of the possessions of the rich leads of necessity to a rebirth of that same class of the rich. So, here's what they didn't seem to understand. Concentration of those same expropriated means into a small class of holders can also lead to the recreation of massive private monopolies. And in fact, it did in his case, in the case of Russia. First, it led to state centralization, but at the same time, they had a very hefty private industry. And that private industry grew over the course of the Soviet Union until eventually the Soviet Union fell and they just got regular old capitalism, which was not a huge conversion by that point. So his assumption that if you just actually directly empowered the workers with shares of should be said with a distribution of the means of production and therefore direct control by them, ownership of the means of production by the workers, he says that that's going to turn back into capitalism. But what was actually borne out was that what really brought them back into capitalism was handing off the means of production to a new, narrow group of state controllers who then just collaborated with a small group of private controllers, many of them who were part of the czarist power structure and were part of previous private power structures before the revolution. So this is just another failed prediction. He says, it's up to the working class not to carry out a share out that would favor the petit bourgeois and the ragged mob. Oh, no. Yeah, here he starts talking shit about the lumpen proletariat. He really doesn't like people without jobs. But to see that the means of production to be expropriated are used socially and collectively in a systematic, organized fashion. And of course, he means that a small group of technocrats should have control over it. And that small group of technocrats who knows better than the masses will direct how all of the assets that the masses just struggled to emancipate from a small group of exploiters should now be controlled by a new group of technicians and administrators who, because of their extreme enlightened status in the vanguard, are just going to know exactly what to do with everything. And they're just out of the kindness of their hearts, they're just going to do it because it's good for everybody. That's how this works, right? This is what I mean. Back to this non-materialist understanding of the state. So he is afraid that if we actually distributed ownership of the means of production to the people, which is to say in the form of like cooperatives, that, this was going to benefit the petit bourgeois and the ragged mob. The petit bourgeois, that's bizarre. I mean, like the petit bourgeois, many of them were going to be expropriated in this process. And instead, what you would get is the destruction of the petit bourgeois status in society. Once again, this would be distributing the worker ownership among organized groups of people. But I really don't think that he understands what anarchists wanted. What anarchists wanted was for, council structures and bodies of mutual agreement should come together and communally own things, which they made decisions on. And larger federated structures of those would make decisions together with their communally owned property. So that would be this mass share out that anarchists are advocating. But he thinks that we would literally split it up between everybody, including the lumpen proletariat and the previous petit bourgeois, and then tell them, okay, now do a capitalism. Again, just really he's demonstrating his lack of knowledge about what anarchists were advocating. And that he thinks that, once again, they don't want anything being done collectively in a systematic and organized fashion. Once again, just demonstrating he doesn't know what he's talking about. Not specific to Bukharin, honestly, just this is how every authoritarian approaches this subject, ignorance. And that, in turn, is only possible where expropriation is effected in an organized way. And we agree. Under the control of the proletarian institutions. Okay, once again, we agree. We just disagree on what a proletarian institution is. He says, otherwise, expropriation takes on a frankly disorganized complexion and easily degenerates into mere appropriation by private individuals of what ought to be the property of society as a whole. No, the federations of horizontal councils, that is it becoming the property of society as a whole. What you want is private expropriation. You want to put that property in the hands of a small group of people. He says Russian society, and particularly industry and agricultural industry, is passing through a period of crisis and total ruin. These tremendous difficulties result not only in the obvious destruction of productive forces, but also in the massive disorganization of the whole economic setup. As a result, the workers ought, more than ever today, to take care to take an exact inventory of and to supervise all the means of production, dwellings, consumer products requisitioned, and so on. Such supervision is possible only where expropriation is the work not of private individuals or groups, but of the organs of proletarian power. Now, once again, if all that is meant by the organs of proletarian power are these, council structures wherein we have a communal ownership of the means of production, then anarchists agree. Or the anarchists of his time did. And once again, as time went on, there was more of a split and you get more individualist anarchists that perhaps some of these criticisms would land, but during his time, those were not the majority of anarchists. So once again, we're taking this as being critiques of the anarchists he was cohabitating with. And these critiques absolutely just do not land under any circumstances in that case. Now we're on to section 3, and we are coming up on the end. I think this is the shortest of the 3 sections. He says, we have purposely avoided arguing against anarchists as if they were delinquents, criminals, bandits, and so on. Agreed, Bukharin, you have done so, and I actually think that puts you a notch above many others. He says, the important thing for workers is to understand what is pernicious in their teachings and the origin of noxious praxis. We cannot have a superficial squabble at the focal point of our argument. Everything that has already been said explains in itself why it should be that it is precisely the anarchist groups that rapidly spawn bands of expropriators who expropriate for the sake of their own pockets, and why the anarchists attract delinquents. Yeah, it's almost like Bukharin that they attract delinquents because anarchism is the political philosophy of those who are oppressed. And many of those in the lumpen proletariat are very oppressed. Generally, people who have been pushed out of even being able to work like normal 9-to-5 jobs or jobs that are considered like acceptable and normal in society, those people are a very, very underclass. That is the underclass. And this sort of like backwards, like puritanical hatred of the lumpen proletariat really did not age well. And in fact, it was the break with this false assumption that led to more success in examples such as the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party had to organize many people who were in that lumpen proletariat who were not part of the quote unquote productive classes, as Bukharin seems to be fetishizing here. And yet the Black Panther Party got further than any other sort of like vanguard party in the United States. It did it precisely by defying Bukharin's conception of what the lumpen proletariat was. And the anarchists have always tended to attract that lumpen proletariat because their analysis is a complete, exhaustive analysis of how oppression works. And therefore, of course, they're going to attract workers because it talks to them about how economic exploitation works, and they're going to attract people who can't even get a job because the anarchist analysis goes that far. It gives you an analysis of how even that underclass is being exploited, how the criminal underclass is being exploited by society. So yes, that's why, Bukharin. There are always and everywhere disruptive elements that exploit the revolution for their own private gain, of course, but that is not just synonymous with the lumpen proletariat. And I really dislike that characterization. He says, but where expropriation is carried out under the control of mass organs, it is much more difficult for the private profit situation to arise. There we agree. On the other hand, when one shuns participation in organized mass action on principle, anarchists don't, and substitutes for them the action of free groups. What? Like, what do you think happened? What do you think free groups are? They were like groups that just like, once again, like now he actually is portraying them as like bandits and delinquents and stuff, that make their own decisions autonomously and independently. One creates the best possible atmosphere for expropriations that are, theoretically and in practical terms, no different from the activities of a common street thief. This is how many of the factory committees were created right before this revolution. Literally direct seizures. It's just so absurd that he's even saying this right now. individual expropriations and confiscations and so on are not only dangerous on account of the fact that they act as a brake on the creation of an apparatus of production, distribution, and control, but also because such actions completely demoralize the men who carry them out and deprive them of class consciousness, make them unused to collaboration with their comrades, and abandon these in favor of a single group of even a single free individual. Once again, if this were a critique of individualist anarchism, then I would probably agree with it. But he's not critiquing individualist anarchists. He is pretending that social anarchists are individualist anarchists here. That's all this is. You know? It just sounds like he's like kind of pearl clutching about anarchists being willing to do things which are apparently criminal, to expropriate the means of production and to put them in the hands of the workers, which is how a lot of these factory committees and workers' councils were created before the revolution. He says there are two sides of the workers' revolution, the destructive side and the creative or reconstructive side. Wow, Bukharin, that's literally what anarchists have been saying since the late 1800s. He says the destructive side shows above all in the destruction of the bourgeois state. The social democratic opportunists claim that in no shape or form does the proletariat's capture of power mean the destruction of the capitalist state, but such a capture exists only in the minds of a few individuals. In reality, the capture of power by the workers can become a reality only through the destruction of the power of the bourgeois. All right. He says, the anarchists have a positive role to play in this labor of destroying the bourgeois state, but in organic terms, they are incapable of creating a new world. And on the other hand, once the proletariat has taken power, when the most urgent task is to build socialism, then anarchists have an almost exclusively negative role, harassing such constructive activity with their wildcat and disorganizing actions. Just more pearl clutching, but also mixed with falsehood. Like he just finished saying that anarchists are happy to take up positions in the Soviets. And then he's like, I don't know, it seems contradictory because I don't understand things. But then he's like, but they're also saboteurs because they won't cooperate. And it's like, wait, then I thought you just said that the vast majority of them took place in the Soviets. And I like his underhanded insult about wildcat strikes. Oh no, not wildcat strikes. We wouldn't want the workers to get the idea that they want to strike, without notice and without legal representation. Just ridiculous. It says communism and communist revolution, that is the cause of the proletariat, of the productively active class. Once again, this is just an insult to the lumpen proletariat, through the apparatus of large-scale production. As for all the other strata of the poor classes, they can only become agents of communist revolution whenever they protect the rear of the proletariat. Holy shit. Wow. Yeah, that's extremely overt. He's just like, listen, if you don't got a job, your only duty is to protect the proletarian, okay? So you just need to be the rear guard. Oh, you're a criminal. You're the underclass. You've been pushed under by society, and you can't even survive in the main part of the economy. Well, I'm sorry. All you can do is protect the proletariat when the war comes, and hopefully try to help them. Otherwise, you're fighting back against the emancipation of the working class. It's like, this is what happens when you don't have a robust power analysis. This is why I'm an anarchist, is because these things are so fundamentally misplaced. I think that at best, the bourgeois and the proletarian distinction is useful, but the petite bourgeois distinction is kind of useful, sometimes not. And the lumpen proletariat distinction is absolutely useless and only reflected the biases of the people who are writing about the lumpen proletariat. It was them being snobbish, most of them having been well-to-do, who just didn't want to associate themselves with the dirty rabble. He says, anarchy is the ideology not of the proletariat, but of declassed groups, inactive groups, lacking a connection with all productive labor. It is the ideology of a horde of beggars, lumpen proletariat. a category of people drawing its recruits from among proletarians, ruined bourgeois, decadent intellectuals, peasants cast out by their families and impoverished, an amalgam of people incapable of creating anything new, anything of value, only seizing what they have got their hands on through their confiscations. Such is the social phenomenon of anarchy. Yeah, wow. Just all these comments about the lumpen proletariat are so incredibly backwards and so clearly demonstrate his having like no connection with the underclass, the declassed, as he says. Just pearl clutching. He says, anarchy is the product of the disintegration of capitalist society. The complexion of this misery is brought about by the crumbling of social bonds, the transformation of people who were once members of a class into atomized individuals who no longer depend on any class, who live for themselves, do not work, and who, to hold on to their individualism, acknowledge no organization. That is the misery produced by the barbaric capitalist regime. Yeah, I mean, he's just repeating things that I've already completely dismantled previous here. And yeah, then this is the very end. He says, a class as healthy as the proletarian one cannot allow itself to catch the contagion of anarchy. Anarchy could emerge from one of its extremes only if that working class were to break up, and then as a sign of sickness. And the working class, struggling against its economic dissolution, must likewise fight against its ideological dissolution, the product of which is anarchy. That's it. That's the whole essay by Bukharin. I think you can probably see that this is a much more sophisticated essay than On Authority, right? I mean, if you watched On Authority, the On Authority video before this, Engels didn't even make one good argument. He essentially had no idea what was going on with any of the terminology involved. He was mostly just a sophist, right? That was his whole thing. He was just really trying to do wordplay. He was really giving very little substantive rebuttal to anything an anarchist would say. And it was a worthless essay. Has no real purpose for any sort of analysis, I'd say. This essay, Bukharin was at least trying. Bukharin clearly was an intelligent guy. I think he was well studied in Marx. And he had a better line on many of these topics than other Marxists I've heard. But overall, pretty mid, pretty mid. Like, I'd say, given what it was, how it was kind of destined to be a bad critique, because I don't think there is such a thing as a good critique of anarchism by an authoritarian. As far as authoritarian critique go, I'll give it like a 4 or 5. On Authority is like a 1, because I can't give it a 0. It's 1 to 10. But this was like a 4, 4 or 5. He at least had some good points mixed in. If he was referring to a group of people who were in the future, like 50 years, 60 years in the future. And at least the discussion of economic centralization and decentralization was interesting to consider and think about and discuss. But I still think that he was ultimately not understanding the anarchist position. And I hopefully I've explained why that's the case. If you are interested in an anarchist view of power, I recommend you go watch my video essay or read it. It's on Anarchist Library called Power. And if you are looking for something more sophisticated as well, that's going to give you a much better overview of just how power functions and just the anarchist conception in general, I recommend going to watch A Modern Anarchism Parts 1, 2, and 3. And currently Part 4 is in production. I'm still writing the script. So yeah, I think that's about it for this one. I just want to say that if you've gotten this far, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also, damn, have you seen more than one of these videos? They've been serving these up and you're watching them. And then here you are, like, I don't know, was it like an hour and 20 minutes into this video and you're still watching? You should go over to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Anark, ANARK, and become a patron for any amount. There's like $2, like a $5, $7, $10, $20 if you're like rich or something, I guess. I don't know. But that Patreon is what allows me to keep making videos on this channel. It's what has been allowing me to start being a little more flexible, start doing longer videos, also to kind of do like live streams a little more often, which, by the way, get my subscriber count up to the next big milestone, and I will do another big live stream, and I don't know, we'll make it like a marathon or something. So, you know, there's a little bit of incentive to click subscribe. But that's about it. Oh, also, I've got this copy of A Modern Anarchism Part 1 published by Seditionist Media. Let's get it. Seditionist. Okay. No copyright and all that, blah, blah, blah. You can go to their website and you can get a copy of this book for yourself. Look at this pretty cover. Oh, beautiful. Wonderful, beautiful, wonderful, beautiful. Anyway, I don't make any money off of it, but that's just so people can have a physical copy. If you've been looking, that's just part 1, by the way. That's not all parts yet, but we are working on getting part 2 and then eventually part 3 and maybe part 4 in physical format. So yeah, like go to their Twitter and send them a DM and they'll send you a copy. I think that's about it. I think I've finished my spiel here. Hopefully that was enlightening. I think I'm going to do at least 1 or 2 more of these. I've been enjoying them. That's it. I'm done. Let the pitch end. I'll see you next time.